Well, I was glad I brought Texas weather with me today. So y'all can thank me for that. And I go home tomorrow and I hear it's going home too. So, but thank you all for coming. I'm very glad to be here and get to meet a lot of my Baker and Brazos team. And so see faces for the people that were behind the making of Biblical Woman. Oh, is it not on? You can't hear me now? No, just way closer. Oh, is it on now? Yeah. Did y'all hear anything I said? Yeah. I said, you can thank me for bringing Texas weather. And that was about the only important thing I said. So,
and let me test to this one on too. Okay, we're good.
Yeah, we're good. So we'll talk for a little bit and then we'll answer questions from y'all. So thank you so much for coming.
Yeah. So this is very exciting. We've been able to do a couple of events, but always in Texas. And so very excited to have Beth here in Michigan. And so I have a number of questions, and I've tried to pick not just the ones that you get all the time. And so I thought I would start off, first question, how many pairs of leggings do you own?
That is a great question. So, you know, the sad thing is I actually don't wear leggings and I'm regretting that at the moment because I think I'm gonna have to go buy some now because of that. However, my daughter owns a lot of leggings. So I can at least put that out there. And her shorts never meet the dress code. Can I say that in public? So maybe that I might get in trouble for that. I do wear skinny jeans though because they're really comfortable. So does that count as leggings? So there you are. You win on the leggings.
So, and if you're wondering what we're talking about, just for folks on Twitter. Okay. More seriously, I would love to have you share just a little bit how your life has changed in the past year.
We could probably both talk about this for a while. So I was thinking last night when I was at the Prince Conference Center on the Calvin University campus. That's where I stayed, I guess 4 years ago. When was that? 2018. Seems a lifetime ago. When I was up here for a conference. And my life was really different than it was. I could hide places really well. I usually didn't bother wearing my name tag because I don't really care if people knew who I was, and most people didn't. It was fine. And I just remember that. And I think I only had like 500 people following me on Twitter. Which was very, very different. And so my life has changed in a lot of ways I never expected, I think, because of the making of Biblical Womanhood. I tell people all the time that I had no idea what this book was going to do. I still remember Kristin and I never did have any plots. I'll put that out there. We did, however, meet for coffee before, and we did have a conversation before either of our books was published, and not really sure. Kristin already had a sense that Jesus and John Wayne was getting attention from journalists and people who are interested. So she was beginning to get a sense that things might be changing for her. And I was still in the process of writing my manuscript. And so I just really had absolutely no idea. But I think despite the challenges that have changed in my life, which is having much more presence on social media and having, at least in Texas, my daughter gets always irritated when I get stopped and asked for autographs about things. She's like, Mom. So she, it's despite those things happening, I'm just so grateful that I am part of maybe change that's happening in the church. And so mostly I feel grateful, despite the way my life has become a lot more busy in ways that I never expected. So.
I do remember messaging you. I think it was after I first tweeted the announcement of your book. And I think that your publishing team probably has the stats on that, but it moved it up to bestseller rank on Amazon for a couple days, I think. And I remember at that point messaging you and telling you to do whatever you needed to do in your life in the next few weeks before the book came out, to go on a vacation and to spend time with your family.
That is exactly what she said. In fact, I woke up that morning to a text from Kristin that said, go look at your numbers. And that was what I woke up to that morning, telling me that things were going to be different. It really was. It was just really shocking. However, at the same time, I think I have a lot of boundaries in my life too, because I live in a dorm. For you don't know that, I live with undergraduate students, which is a lot of fun, but it also keeps a lot of normalcy in my life, because to them, I'm just the person who bakes brownies and waffles. And a lot of them, it takes them a while to connect me with the person seriously. A lot of them have no idea. And that's really nice to have that level of normalcy. So,
okay. So I have so many questions here. I'm trying to think of how many we can get through. A more writerly question. A lot of academics find it challenging to do this kind of crossover book, the kind that both of our books are, and I think maybe especially yours. And you seem to have a knack for it. What tips would you have for other writers? How have you adapted your writing? How is your writing for popular audiences different from your academic writing?
oh, yeah, that's very good. So when The Making of Biblical Womanhood started doing well, my publisher of my first book, which was my dissertation, The Pastoral Care of Women in Late Medieval England, started selling out of their old stock. It's and I remember my husband, he was like, people are going to be really surprised when they were like, do they know that is not that is not the style in which you wrote Making a Biblical Womanhood. So it is a different voice. However, I think, the way that I learned to do it was writing on the anxious bench, was writing in public. I mean, I think the tip for people is you've got to write for public and see if people read it. And if they don't read it, then you try something else. And you so it's not, I tell people all the time, writing, I guess there are some people who are naturally born better writers than others, maybe because of things in their disposition, but writing's a skill. It's a learned skill. You learn how to do it. And the only way you learn how to do something is by writing. And you've just got to try it. And so I think that I've had a lot of practice. I've been writing for the public since 2015. On the anxious bench, and I learned early on that my posts that hit and got a lot of attention, like I had a post that ended up in the Washington Post in 2016, had nothing to do with Making a Biblical Womanhood. It had to do with Halloween. And the way that I told that story was actually, I told a story about carving pumpkins with my kids, and that got me into it, and people just read that. In fact, it's now gotten in Sunday school material, that article. It's called, what is it called? It's something about how that Halloween is Christian. Something like that is what I've titled it. But so I learned that voice worked, that people read that. And so then I began to cultivate that voice on the anxious bench. And that is what laid the groundwork. When I decided to write The Making of Biblical Womanhood, that was the voice that I decided to use, which also meant that it was, and I had this conversation with Kristin too, it put a risk out there for me because it was a personal narrative that I was going to intertwine with it. And that was a decision, that was a conscious decision that I made, that it took me a while to make, because I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that or not. But I also wanted people to know what I knew. So that was why I decided to do it.
It's so interesting that you credit your blogging, and of course you brought me over to the anxious bench, and I was reluctant, and I said I do not have time for one more thing, and you told me that to trust you, and that the more that I would write for the blog, the quicker my academic writing would come. And I totally did not believe you, but I'm very bad at saying no, so I agreed to do it. And it was so true. So for any other writers or academics, I mean, that's what I found. The blogging for me did a couple of things. First, I knew that my writers were always tempted to click away. And so I really fought for their attention every single paragraph. And then it also taught me to write quickly. I mean, my first blog post would take an entire day, and then I got it down to about an hour and a half after about 3 years, right? So
You're better than me. It still takes me hours.
So, which when you have a looming deadline and an ambitious book project, it was a really good, it doesn't have to be perfect, you get it on paper, so.
Yeah, that is true. You learn to live with things that you don't have to do everything perfection. But Kristin's better. It usually still takes me 7 to 10 hours to write a blog post, which is too long, and it's because I stress over the word. We have different personalities, if y'all haven't noticed that. But anyway, Kristin thinks faster than I do, I think.
And Beth is nicer than I am. Okay, so speaking of differences, you are a medievalist. In fact, we were just having a conversation with my colleague, Franz Mira, another medievalist in the room. And it was fun for me to listen to those two talk because they were talking about scholars and historical figures that I have never heard of. Now, I had the advantage, I think, in Jesus and John Wayne. I'm a 20th century Americanist. And then I wrote a book on the people who are responding to the book, for better or worse. And you are an expert in medieval history, and you then brought it up to the present. And so now you are in the thick of some of these very current conversations. How has that been for you?
So Kristin gets a lot of text from me where I'm like, who's this person? I have no idea. And she's like, Beth, this is who this is. And gives me like a quick sentence. And so, I mean, seriously, I have a lot of ignorance about a whole lot of these people. I learned a lot of these people through reading Jesus and John Wayne and finding out, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's who that guy was. And so it's sort of funny to me because there is a lot of this world of modern evangelicalism, especially the politics involved with it, that I really didn't know about until I got into this. Now, I was pretty good on Baptist politics. That is in place. I knew a lot of the players. I'm at Baylor, and Baylor was in the middle of those Baptist battles. In fact, Baylor, I don't know if y'all know this is trivia about Baylor. People ask me all the time why I'm not fired yet. And I'm like, well, because Baylor is a moderate Baptist university. And a couple of weeks before there was a plan to take over the regents at Baylor, and Baylor actually changed the number of regents that came from the SBC, which prevented it from being taken over like other Baptist universities. And so that's why Baylor is who it is today, and why we have a seminary, a Baptist seminary that ordains women. So that, I think, anyway, what was your question? How do I know these people? Yeah. So I think that, so I was very well versed in the Baptist world, and I've had to learn some of the other players. Like I didn't know who a lot of people were associated with the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, aside from some of the major ones like Al Mohler. The people who were Baptist I knew, but I didn't know any of the other people. So sometimes I feel like I'm waded into a world that I didn't know was out there. But it also gives me a lot of peace because I don't know who I've offended. And that sometimes is helpful. I don't figure out till later that was somebody who was really important. And I'm like, oh, well, there you are. It's too late now. So I don't know. So I think that, so maybe it gives me a little bit, it helps because I don't know who these people are.
Okay, couple more questions. If you could choose one figure from your book to debate Owen Strachan, who would it be?
There's no contest here. I would put him up against Marjorie Kemp. I think that would be one of the funniest things. I always tell people, we were talking about this earlier, I wouldn't want to be Marjorie's friend, but I would love to see her to debate the people at the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. I think that would be really, really fun. The other, maybe more seriously, I might put them, put her up against Catherine of Siena. That would be really fantastic. I think they would not be able to hold their ground against some of these medieval women theologians. So there's all sorts I could put, but I think Marjorie Kemp would be a lot of fun.
So, and I have to say, my husband came up with that question, so credit to him. And tell us about your next book.
Oh, sure. Yes, so this was fun. When I initially decided to do the Making of Biblical Womanhood, it is really true that I didn't intend to do anything else after that, sort of in this public trade world. This was kind of like my last ditch effort, act of desperation. I've got to let people know what I know, and then I'm going to go back to being a medievalist and hiding out in the archives and reading 15th century sermons, which most other people don't read. So that was sort of my plan. But after the initial noise of the Making of Biblical Womanhood began to settle, I realized that people were reading. And people were not only reading, but there was, in fact, I just wrote about this in my postscript, when I really began to realize that people were changing their minds. And I started thinking, and I was like, I can help in this situation. And so then I started thinking about the pieces that I had put aside for the Making of Biblical Womanhood, because they only gave me 60,000 words. It came out at 72,000. So I got a little bit of leeway, but that's like short, if you think about it from an academic standpoint. And so there was a lot of stuff that I just didn't even try to include. And so I thought, this is a chance where I can do maybe something else. But I still wasn't sure for a while until I was thinking about it. It was actually a Twitter conversation. And I think actually Kristin retweeted it or something. I was like, what should I write about? What are people interested in? If I did something else, what were they interested in? And I think I got maybe one of the biggest responses I've ever had on a Twitter question. And everyone wanted me to write on being a pastor's wife, which I was like, well, that would be really interesting. But at the same time, I also was like, but that's a small story. I don't know if I just want to write on that. I don't want it just to be something where I'm just kind of talking about my experiences as a pastor wife, and maybe just, for me, if I'm only tying it back 2 centuries, that's like, it's like, that's not a story. Sorry. It's like, that's contemporary. So I was like, what am I? And I began thinking about it, and essentially I began writing out sort of a research. That's what you do. You go to the evidence and you start looking. And I started thinking hard about it, and I suddenly realized that when there's a changing conversation about women's ordination and women preaching and all of these, while women have never done this in large droves, there have always been women doing this. And I also knew that the conversations about this change around the Reformation, and that's also the time when the office of the pastor's wife gets introduced to us. One of my graduate student colleagues, she was a graduate student with me, she actually worked on priest tours, is what they were called, the wives of priests, before priests were allowed to have them. And so I had read a lot of her scholarship on that, and I started thinking, and I was like, you know what, there's a story here about, and that would give the backstory, because a lot of people who find themselves in the role of pastor's wife, it's a weird role. It's a role that has no power, but has great responsibility and carries most of the complaints of the church. And it's like, how did we get such a weird role? And when I realized that it fits with the history of ordination, I was like, I can tell a story. And so that's what I'm doing. Becoming the pastor's wife is the story of women's ordination, what happened to conversations about women's ordination and the rise of the office of a pastor's wife. And I'm so excited about it. I've already written the introduction to it, and I'm really excited to keep going. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
And after that?
Oh, and after that too, yes, this was another piece. In fact, this originally was, I was thinking about doing it. And one of the things that I write a lot about on the anxious bench is us forgetting medieval history. That's one of my pet peeves all the time. I'm like, why are people so upset about this? That's exactly what got me into writing. What became part of making a biblical womanhood was all of the debate over gender inclusive language, which was really funny to me. And so that was one. And so I'm like, why is everybody so upset about this? I run into this all the time in these 15th century sermons in which they translate the Bible, reading it out to the people, and they insert women back into the scriptural text to make sure that they understand that this, for both of them. And so I'm like, I don't know why people are so upset about this. And so I realized a lot that I think part of our problem of evangelicals is that our history is too short, and that we don't have the roots to really be able to evaluate things. And so my third book, I'm calling it my trilogy now, my Making Biblical Womanhood trilogy, is called Losing Our Medieval Religion. And I am going to talk about the impact of us being short-sighted in our history. And I'm going to talk about a lot of fun medieval stuff. So I'm excited about it.
All right, at this point, I think we are ready for questions.
Yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Smith. I have had the pleasure of working with Beth at Brazos Press, and I am going to be taking some of the questions that y'all have been emailing in to events email and reading them here for Beth and Kristin. So you can keep submitting questions as we go, but we'll just get started. So the first one, this is for both of you. So the question is, how have your book releases impacted or maybe not impacted your relationships with those you attend church weekly with? And so I'll let you decide. Maybe Beth, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So I keep telling people my church is really small, very small. Kristin's been to it. And it took my husband finally in a business meeting said, y'all, I just should make you aware of this fact that my wife wrote this book. Nobody knew. Nobody was concerned about it. And then when they found out I did, they were all like, oh, I'm gonna go get a copy. I don't think they've read it. But it's also another I have all of these things in my life that keep things normal. And my church is one of them, because the Making a Biblical Womanhood isn't I think a lot of the people in our church probably grew up and knew some of this stuff. I mean, our church had women in the pulpit for a long time. And, we just ordained another woman a few weeks ago. And so the conversation is different. And so I think it's not, so I don't get pushback from people in my church, which is probably what the question is about. Now, that's not that I would tell a different story if you asked me about my experiences in my hometown, in Waco. I do get a lot of pushback from pastors in the area, but not in my church.
So I joined my church here, Church of the Servant, maybe 3.5 years ago, not all that long ago. So our previous church had shut down. And up until I joined Church of the Servant, I had always felt it kind of necessary to hide part of who I was, the academic, feminist, it didn't ever fully fit in the churches that I was a member of. And it was I made that choice for various reasons to attend particular churches, and I knew that was a cost, and I was okay living with it. This is the first time I attended church where I don't feel like I have to hide that part, that I am an academic and that I have things to say. And so it's actually been quite nice of course, my book released during the pandemic, and so there wasn't a lot of reaction, but we did a book club in the church, and it's just been really nice to know that I'm kind of fully known there, and I can bring my whole self into that space. And many people in that church are doing incredible work in all sorts of different directions, and so it's also just kind of a normal space, but it's been very very grounding for me, I will say, to be a part of that church and to have strong, beautiful preaching liturgies every week, so it's just a really important space for me.
Yeah, no, and, I will second, this is the first time I've been in a church where I felt like I didn't have to hide anything either. And so I think that's hard, and I've learned from people who've reached out to me that so many people feel like they have to hide in their churches. And it seems to me that that's a problem when we are all feeling like we have to hide in our churches, so.
How do you think about the, maybe you would call it accusations from people that claim that you're writing as a theologian just because you're writing about theological topics, even though you're writing as a historian?
I was going to make Kristin take it first when he said accusations. But I guess I get the theologian one. Do you get accused of that?
I do.
Okay.
Strangely, I should first because I'm less of a theologian, I suppose. Yeah, it's funny because I get hit from both sides on that. Both you're usurping the role of theologians, and also where's the theology? And you need more Bible verses in this book and more takeaways. And so like, kind of on both sides, I find it, for a while there, I was doing a lot of Twitter threads on historical methodology. Hey, this is how historians operate. This is what we do. This is what we usually don't do. And so it's been really interesting, though. I think that part of what both of us have run up against is that the people who find our work most disruptive. So in my case, some of these organizations and men that I write about are very accustomed to having the theological battles. That's their turf. And what I'm doing in Jesus and John Wayne is something different. It's explaining the terms of those conversations, explaining why those conversations are happening right now and in this particular way. And there seems to be a disconnect often in the way some of my critics are reading Jesus and John Wayne through their lens of, it's very apologetic oriented, their kind of work, and so deeply suspicious if I uncover stories or evidence that don't affirm what they think is right or true, or don't present them in a good light. So it's been actually quite interesting to see that response, and it's allowed me to take what I do in the classroom all the time in my intro courses. This is how historians work. This is how we use evidence. This is how we build arguments, and to kind of bring that into social media spaces. But yeah, I think I get less. I don't know if I get less pushback, but our books are different in how we engage theology.
And I forgot that you don't love part theology. So yes.
Also that.
Yes.
I'm a failure to love.
You're a failure to love. Yeah, that's right. I forgot. Because she's not as nice as me. So I think our favorite one was the person who wrote that I was the less arrogant one. So we had a lot of fun with that. Anyway, so theology, so I do get this quite a bit. And the reason, of course, is that The Making of Biblical Womanhood is not a theological book. It is a historical book about the development of a particular theology. And so I think that's where, because that, and in some ways, that's also what Kristin's doing, is just that the political part too is so much more. There's no politics. I mean, I am writing the history of a theology, of a particular theology that manifests in different ways, but most, the one that I'm really going after is the one that's in our presence right now. So I think that's why I get this. I mean, it does make sense that I would get this. I always joke with people that I'm not a theologian. In fact, I could tell you when I was working on my PhD, I would get impatient with theologians because I'm like, you can't understand theology without history. And so I would get really impatient with people who would just simply want to talk about theology and theological discourse separate from historical context. And that always really annoyed me. And so it's funny when people accuse me of being a theologian, because I'm like, you know how annoyed I've been at theologians all of my career? So it's funny. But then again, I do understand that I'm writing the history of a theology. And so I understand how those lines get blurry. At the same time, even though I'm annoyed at theologians, I also have a lot of theological training. My second field was religious studies. I took a lot of my courses at Duke Divinity School, even though I got my degree at Chapel Hill. So I actually have a lot. So it's kind of funny to me when people, because I'm like, I wonder if my theological training is actually better than yours. I don't say that, but I'm sitting there, it's kind of funny, I think about it. And anyway, so, but I think the problem is, I think maybe one of the problems is that people don't realize how much of our theology is shaped by history. And when we show them, it makes them mad because they think theology is this pure thing that comes only from our understanding of God, and not realizing that we never look at God without looking through the world in which we live. And you just have to understand that we carry who we are to the Bible, and people get upset. So I think that's what both of us, maybe why we have triggered a lot of folk, because we have brought them face to face with the fact that their theology is not as pure as they thought it was.
Okay, this question is an advice question. So what would each of your advice be for talking about the topics of your book with someone maybe at the dinner table who, for whatever reason, probably wouldn't read your book, whether if they're opposed to it or that it just feels big and complicated and not connected to them? What would your advice be for having conversations with people who we care about like that?
I was thinking about throwing Kristin under the bus, but anyway, so I'll start. I do get asked this a lot, how do I approach this with people who are going to be really upset and offended, but I want them to read your book. So my advice is always, you've got to start with asking questions with people. I think the conversations that don't seem to go anywhere to me are when you confront people with "you're absolutely wrong, and this is why you're wrong, and I'm going to tell you why you're wrong." Those usually don't work out well. But if you ask people why they think this, if they're like, "Oh, well, I won't read a book on women preaching because that's not my theology," and you're like, "Oh, that's interesting, why?" And if you can get them talking and thinking about it, what I have found is a lot of people, when they are confronted with why, it takes them a while, why do I believe that? Is it because my church has always taught that? Is it because of something that I learned growing up? Is it actually because of the Bible? And so that is often a way that you can get a conversation started without shutting people out. And then if people go to the biblical text, if they start quoting Timothy, I always suggest that people just go to Romans 16 and be like, well, how does that reconcile with Romans 16? Let's go look at that and see what that says. And so those are sort of the two things that I often do is I ask questions, and I find that helps maybe sometimes to diffuse situations. But there are some, you cannot take some people with you. And there are just going to be conversations that may just be a topic you should avoid. So until they are ready, it's like teenagers, until they are ready, they are not going to learn it from you.
So I did not put a lot of thought into wooing resistant readers when I wrote Jesus in Shadow. So I have to think about this. I'll just tell a story instead. One of my favorite stories that was shared on Twitter actually was from a woman who talked about how she had this conversation and got her dad to read Jesus and John Wayne. And he was very resistant, did not like the subtitle and didn't like the introduction at all, but she just got him to read the whole thing. And she said that he fought the book every step of the way until the last chapter. And then when he finished that last chapter, he put the book down and said, let's talk, we need to talk. And so that is a story that I hold on to, that you can fight all the way through, just get to the end and let it sink in. If you can get that far, and the timing won't always be right, and but just grapple with it.
Okay, this question is directed to Kristin, and I hope I'm reading this right because it's a don't instead of a do, but we'll see. And Beth, maybe you can comment afterwards. So the question is, I've heard you say in podcasts a couple times that you don't hold out hope for the American church. Hope I'm getting that one right. And so the question is, based on your study of religious history, what are some of your thoughts about what the future of U.S. Christianity might look like?
That's an unfair question to ask a historian. We live to the past. But first, let me talk about this question of hope, which is funny because early this morning I was actually editing my Conference on Faith and History keynote that is going to be published in Few Days at Historia, the journal of the Conference on Faith and History, which is where I address this, my not just failure to love, but also failure to hope. And yeah, if you've heard me speak before, you probably heard the story about how got to the end of the manuscript and my editor just emailed me and said, "This is a really depressing book." And I said, I know. And he said, "No, this is actually a problem. You can't do this to your readers." And so I took a look and I tried to come up with something, and I wrote back and said, this is what I've got. Sorry. And he's okay, I respect that. And then the next day he wrote again, like, "Kristin, just give us anything." And so that's where the last sentence of the book came from. And when I sent it to him, and I've told this story before, I felt really sheepish. I just don't feel equipped with the last sentence. Really sheepish. It just felt so insufficient. But he said, "Fine, I'll take it." And what was once done might also be undone, because there is a power to knowing history, especially I think for evangelicals, or like you said, even seeing theology or their beliefs on anything is often perceived as, this is God's word. This is on my immediate access to God's word, and indisputable. History shows us how things haven't always been this way, how these beliefs have come to be and have come to seem like they are inevitable and timeless. And so I do think that there is a power in history, knowing history. That frees us to ask, is this where we want to be? Is this how we want things to be? And if not, to try to figure out how to change. So there's hope in that. I don't have a ton of hope for immediate change. And I've said before, I see a lot of individual change and a very little institutional change. And that is holding true for now. As far as I can tell. So what do I see for the future? I honestly have no idea, because I'm actually much less concerned about the fate of Christianity, because I mean, look at church history. The church has never looked great. Christians have never really looked all that good. And somehow the church perseveres and God is in control. I'm much more concerned about the fate of American democracy. And I'm looking at the midterms, and I'm looking at 2024, and that's where my focus is. So on this question of hope, kind of this metaphysical sense, my hope is not in history, and my hope is not in what I see in front of me right now. So as a person of faith, my hope is outside of history, and my hope is in God, and what is around the corner, I don't know. Oh, do you want me to ask that? So, I mean, essentially, it's kind of funny, because when you hear Kristin lay out where her hope is, that's where I've always said my hope is too. But yet, I think I don't know, people interpret it differently. I do think that as a Christian, I've always been hopeful, because Christianity is, it's built on redemption and resurrection. And so I always believe there could be resurrection and redemption. But that doesn't mean that I think the church, evangelicalism, is it going to survive? I don't really care about that too much. What I
you know what, I do care about the church, but I'm also not worried either, because it is going to persevere. It's going to, and hopefully, become better, at least for a while, if you look at history overall. And so that's what I'm aiming for. I'm aiming for people, and you know, I said this more than once too, is that, you know, historians play the long game. That's really what we do. We play our conversations. We look at the past to see how things have developed, and then we tell people how that is, and then we hope that our voices add to a conversation that's growing over time, that's going to shape a narrative. But that narrative is not going to be shaped immediately. And so I think historians are always about playing the long game. And so it doesn't, when we think about, is there going to be change? Probably not in the next 5 or 10 years, but maybe within a couple of generations. You know, so it's something too I think about as a scholar of medieval and Reformation. If you think about the Reformation history, it was only about a generation or two where we saw a pretty significant change happen. Now, when you were living during those generations, it seemed to take forever. But from a historical standpoint, medieval England in 1650 was a rather different place than it was in 1550. And so those are the types, you know, as a historian, I think that's kind of what I'm aiming for, is those types, is change that I think can happen. But it's going to take people living through those changes and passing those changes down to their children before we're going to see really lasting change within institutions.
Alrighty. This question is a little more lighthearted. So what is some of the weirdest or most amusing criticism that you've received about your books? And Beth, maybe we can start with you.
I don't know, Kristin might know some of the things that are more amusing about mine. You know, it is funny the things that people pick up on and that people criticize you for. Some of which, you know, you kind of, I don't know, what is the most amusing criticism that I've gotten about my book? I don't know. You know, I'm thinking about the whole arrogant, that we are being appraised by our arrogance level. I think that's really funny. I think it's really funny the assumptions people make about you. I think that is really funny. You know, I always tell people that when I wrote my first book, The Pastoral Care of Women, I was so terrified that as a practicing Christian, I wanted to make sure and take my historical subjects on their own. And so I was very careful to try to not have any sort of my faith or anything like that sort of come through in the book. And it was really funny because one of the reviewers wrote this, and at the end of the review, she essentially said, you know, this book would have been better if Barr essentially had faith, you know, and she actually, and I was like, well, I guess I did my job well, you know. And so it's really funny to me that with the making of Biblical Womanhood, I get sort of, you know, the same thing because of the topic that I'm writing on, that people want to throw me off the cliff of orthodoxy. And I'm like, y'all just have no idea how traditionally Baptist I am. And that is so amusing to me because I'm like, y'all have no idea how I hate to use the word orthodox, but how traditionally Baptist American Christianity in some ways that I am. So I think it's really funny when people criticize that about me, which I've gotten a lot. That always makes it really funny. I think the funniest though, actually now that I'm thinking about the funniest, and every time, this has changed my whole attitude towards the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Because I used to always be irritated with them whenever I thought about them. But now every time I think about them, I laugh because of Denny Burke's article where he wrote that I advocated for child abandonment. Because I told the story of St. Paula, and the picture that he attached to it is a picture of these two little toddlers standing on the beach. And it is so funny because St. Paula's children were adults. Except when she had a teenage son, but he was like an older teenage son. And it's just because it brings to me the lack of historical knowledge that I'm working with. I'm like, y'all, I'm not going to take anything you say seriously if that is really what you think about St. Paula. And so I think that's the funniest one, and it has made me approach any of their criticism much more lighthearted than I used to, because that I just think about that picture and it makes me laugh every time.
I totally remember that picture. Oh, so many funny things. I mean, so many of the critical reviews actually I find highly entertaining. And so many of them, sometimes I'll have people, how are you doing? That must be really rough. And honestly, like I find it hard to stop myself from just grinning all the way through when I'm reading some of these critiques. And the first one where I did realize that I could not stop smiling as I was reading it was the Christianity Today review. And it started with a story. It was written by the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, and there had been a lot of anticipation. Why aren't they reviewing this book? When I heard it was going to be in the hands of the editor-in-chief, who is not a trained historian, and I thought, well, that doesn't sound good. And then it came out, and it was the whole first part was him reminiscing about his ex-girlfriend, and whom he conceded he had not treated well, but who was supposed to forgive him, but she didn't. And I still don't know exactly what that had to do with my. The best guess that somebody else ventured was that it's a metaphor, and I'm the ex-girlfriend, and I should forgive white evangelical men who, granted, had done some bad things. I don't even know. But anyway, reading that review, I just thought, this is what even is this, right? I'm a historian, and I wrote an academic book, and it was just really funny to see that. And I honestly, I will confess, it's just you here in this room. That when I saw that review, it was apart from an absolutely wonderful review, it was the best gift, because I knew it was just so absurd, and it totally proved the point of the book that it was beautiful. So. So I would say, a lot of reviews really make me laugh. I remember one time an Amazon review about my daughter, who is here somewhere in the back. Yes, waiting, there she is. Likes to read some of these negative reviews to me. She goes for the 1 star, and I can't even remember the exact words. They were scathing. I'm sure she could remember the scathing reviews, but one of them, and I thought, like, wow, this is a lot of emotion. Like, who is this person? You can kind of click on them and figure it out. And I don't know exactly who it is, but I could. Turns out they are a Christian romance writer. And I thought, oh, just wait. I will tell y'all too that we have very different personalities, and I can always count on Kristin to make me laugh about something that has just happened with the making of biblical womanhood. So it's been really good to have that.
Okay, this is going to be our last question. So sometimes Christians, maybe particularly evangelicals or non-denominational, can skip right from Acts to the present day in history with maybe a quick pit stop at the Reformation. Do you have any recommendations to people who want to fill in their gaps of their church history knowledge?
Yes.
Beth was the expert here. So go for it.
I mean, yes. That's actually y'all, you have somebody sitting right there, Franz van Leer. I don't know if y'all know him at Calvin, but I highlighted him in the Making of Biblical Womanhood because he wrote a wonderful book about the medieval Bible that is very accessible. And one of the things that I tried, in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, I covered more than 4,000 years of history within 7,200 words. So when people tell me I left something out, I'm like, y'all, anyway, I guess I find that funny too. I mean, how could I include everything? But I chose who I highlighted in the book. The scholars. There's lots of scholars I could have chosen to put in and all sorts of things, and I just couldn't. They also don't let me write academic footnotes in trade press books, and so I can't have footnotes that cover half the page. So I chose people mostly who I thought were accessible to people, that people could go and pick up their books and actually use them and find them. I couldn't succeed in all of this because, but I tried. This is what I really tried to do. So I tried to highlight things that you can go and read and find now and realize how little church history you actually know. And so that was, so I mean, one thing was just go to my endnotes, go look at my endnotes and just go put down. In fact, I wrote a blog post about a month, maybe a month or 6 weeks ago or something like that. And what I posted was I posted all of the primary sources that I referenced in the Making of Biblical Womanhood. And then I also gave a bibliography for people who want to know more, about women in church history and what they simply just don't know about church history. And I actually included a section on theology on there too. I said, I'm not going to talk about theology, but here's all these people you should read. And then I went to my list of medieval history books, or mostly medieval history books, but a lot of other things too that I think will broaden the understanding. So that's one. So I think, so yes, there's so much, and there's so much accessible. I would get Franz Van Leer's medieval Bible book. It's great, and it's highly accessible. I also, the other thing is, if you want to learn about some of these medieval women, there's some really great, accessible, and inexpensive volumes that have simply Julian of Norwich's showings, or have all of Catherine of Siena's writings, Hildegard of Bingen, and just go read some of these women. And you can get, they're highly accessible. If you want to entertain yourself, go read the Book of Marjorie Kemp. You can get it, Penguin volume, $8. So I would say go to my endnotes and start there. You can also go to that blog post, and I could have a list of things that I think are accessible to people.
I think that's a really good point too, that our books really are built on the scholarship of other historians. And I think that's something that our critics, especially theologian critics, often miss, that like an argument I'm making on page 79, they don't realize that it's not actually my argument. Any historian knows exactly, oh, she's quoting Darren Gotek here. But don't you have to look at the footnotes, but you actually do have to turn to the endnotes in my case, and you can see. So, I'm building on the work of all sorts of other scholars who have come before me, and peer review, and so it's in some ways our works are less innovative than many people think, and historians know that. Historians know, like, well, of course, right? Doesn't everybody know that? And like, no, here we go. But then also there's a magazine called Christian History, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, and it went out of production for a while, and now it's been resurrected again, I believe. And it is a really, really good magazine that every issue just different coverage of different episodes in Christian history. Really smart stuff. And so my parents subscribed to that when I was younger, and I would just page through and just discover things that I never heard about before, and in 3 or 4 pages with glossy photos or illustrations. So now too, with the internet, you can find a lot too, but sometimes just subscribing to a magazine that shows up and it's there on the table, and you pick it up when you're drinking your coffee. It's a good way to go.
Thank you both so much.